Hey everyone, I'm Mrs. Urda. I'm going to be reading to you chapters 24, 25, and 26 from our One School, One Book, Almost Super, so follow along. Chapter 24, My Name is Rafter. I ran. The helicopter door stood open, but I guess it didn't matter. With my new power, I could have ripped the door off its hinges. I could have torn a hole in the side of the aircraft. The pilot made no move to close the door. He wasn't worried about me. In the back of my mind, a warning bell went off. I couldn't turn around now. To my right, the van lurched forward. Juanita extended her hand out of the window, shooting fire from her palm. To my left, Benny was tickling a furious Charles. Inside the helicopter, silence. I reached the door and climbed inside, and came face to face with October Jones. The first thing I noticed was that the supervillain wore a simple flight suit, not a super suit. My mind raced. I felt almost frantic. This man didn't have a super suit. Leader of the whole Jones family, and he didn't feel the need to put on protection or dress up in a costume. He wore a helmet, and his face was partially hidden by a stretch of black fabric that went from the bottom of his left jaw, over his mouth and nose, and attached to the helmet above his right ear. Gray hair poked out from under the helmet, and wrinkles covered his face, but I couldn't guess at his age. He might have been 40, or 60, or 80. The man had cold eyes, and yet at the same time they seethed with fire. If he felt fear, his face revealed none of it. The man sitting in the pilot's chair was in complete control. That scared me more than anything. "Get out of my helicopter, boy," the man said. "Now." His calm voice unnerved me. With great effort, I kept my own words steady, trying to match his. "I'm not a boy. My name is Rafter Bailey, and your name is October Jones." I'd guessed right. Fury grew in October's face. He twisted toward me in his seat and shouted angrily, "I don't care what your name is or who you are. I told you to get out of my helicopter." I didn't move. With lightning speed, he jumped out of his seat, pushing my shoulders. I could have stopped him. With my strength, no one would push me around ever again. But I let him think he had the upper hand, and I fell out of the helicopter and landed on the ground. October lifted his wrist to his mouth and said something I couldn't hear. I stood, shaking myself off. The reflection of the window let me see the hulking figure turn and pound his way toward us. October still crouched by the door of the helicopter. I reached inside and grabbed the villain by his flight suit. But before I could pull, October grabbed my wrist. He pierced me with a cold stare. "I do not have time for this, little boy. I'll deal with you myself if I must." 1 second he was in the helicopter, hand gripping my wrist. The next second he pushed me back, and both of us stood on the ground. He grabbed the front of my coat in a death grip. I did not like the look in his eyes. And then, very suddenly, we were soaring into the cold night sky. Wind roared past my ears. I felt my stomach drop. The lights of the city beneath my feet became little more than tiny points. I didn't know how high we were, 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet, and still we shot toward the stars. I didn't like my chances of surviving a fall at this height, even with my new superpower. Tactics. Another piece of information. October's power was flight. I still had a slight advantage with my strength. The air rushing past my ears grew quiet as we slowed and came to a stop. We hovered in the sky, surrounded by inky darkness. October had me at arm's length, like you might carry a leaking bag of garbage. I reached out and grabbed the front of his flight suit. If he let go of me, I wouldn't fall. "I grow tired of this, boy." October's voice sounded quiet in the stillness of the sky. "I told you," I said, trying to make my voice as calm as his. It was even harder because my teeth were chattering in the cold. "My name is Rafter." "And I told you." October paused. His face broke into a sneer. "Wait a minute. You're one of the new ones, right? His laugh was as cold as the March night air. Hanging on to October's suit wasn't secure enough for me. I swung forward, wrapping my legs around his waist. "Oh, this is delicious," October said. "Let me get this straight. I give you a worthless power, and somehow you still manage to track me down." I heard the word worthless one too many times. I pulled October close and wrapped my arms around him until I had him in a full-body bear hug. I curled my legs together, squeezing his waist in an iron grip, and doing the same with my arms. Not hard enough to break anything, but enough to constrict his breathing. I wanted him to know who he was dealing with, not some worthless kid, but a superhero. October merely laughed. "Afraid of heights?" he mocked. I squeezed harder. This much pressure would crush the ribs of a normal person, but it seemed to be having no effect on October. Maybe his flight suit had armor after all. Or maybe... No. I squeezed with all my might. I grunted with effort. October showed no pain. The only way he could survive my grip was if he had super strength too. October Jones was a super. Chapter 25. Do you see that? I knew real fear in that moment. October could shock me with electricity. He could burn me with fire or lava. That's why he acted like he was in total control, because he was. Looking down, I desperately hoped that he'd somehow lost focus and drifted downward, that my muscles and bones could withstand a fall. If I could pry myself away from him, maybe I'd have a chance. Too high. We were still too high. My mind raced, but I could think of nothing. October had me right where he wanted me. He could finish the job at any time. Staring at the ground below us, I noticed something looked out of place. At first, I couldn't figure out what, and then I saw it. Up here, the entire city was a grid. On that grid were little points of light, just like on the battle maps I always used to form strategies. Some lights didn't move. Those must have been street lamps or house lights. Other lights, probably cars or trucks, crept slowly along the dark lines of streets. At first glance, it was little more than chaos, with lights moving every which way. But if you looked at it, if you really looked, you could see the pattern. There, and there, and there, dozens of cars, maybe as many as 30, all moving from a single place and headed in the same direction. Moving from First Dam toward the city dump. The Baileys and the Johnsons, true superheroes, were on their way to save the day. "Do you see that?" I asked. October looked down. "I see nothing but a very long drop." The fear hadn't left me, but knowing that my family was on their way gave me courage. "The Baileys," I said, "and the Johnsons, superheroes, all of them, coming to save us." I looked back at October, "Coming to fight you." He looked down. I thought I saw just a flicker of surprise, but then it was gone. "Superheroes." The amusement was back in his voice. "They are buffoons." October threw back his head and laughed. It was an ugly laugh, and the darkness amplified it. "I think I like you after all," October said. "I had a plan to execute tonight, and you got in the way. But here you've gone and gathered all the Baileys and the Johnsons to one place, just like I wanted. That makes it ever so convenient for me. This must be your way of asking for forgiveness." Looking back down at the city, I felt a tightness in my chest. My family, and Juanita's, was walking into a trap. I hadn't saved the day. I'd ruined it. My mind raced. There had to be something I could do. This time, all of our lives depended on it. But what could I do against a super? I had my power. I finally had my strength. But it wasn't enough. My power didn't make me super. I needed something more. It's not your power that makes you super. It's what you do with that power. What you do with that power. I knew there was only one thing to do. Chapter 26. I have a question for you, Mr. Jones. Simple tactics in theory, but not so simple to do. Not after everything I'd been through. If your opponent outguns you, you take away his guns. I reached into my pocket for the phone, Charles's phone. It was still on the same screen as when I'd slipped it in my pocket. 2 buttons glowed in the darkness, one of them green, the other red. I have a question for you, Mr. Jones, I said. And I think I'm done with you, boy. October's eyes looked like an angry gray sea. It's time to sweep up this little mess and deposit it in the dump where it belongs. I held up the phone so that October could see it. How long do we have until the tower goes off? I pressed the red button and dropped the phone. Below us, a high-pitched noise got louder and louder. The white sphere at the top of the tower began to crackle with energy. A series of emotions crossed October's face: confusion, understanding, fury, and finally, fear. October Jones was no longer in control. All right, enjoy the rest of the book.